So our bivariate statistics, for this particular study, we're looking at correlations. And we're looking at correlations because we have numeric by numeric pairs of variables at our bivariate level. So if I had numeric by categorical or categorical by categorical pairs, these would be different relationships, different analyses. But for numeric by numeric pairs, so two numeric variables at once, we're looking at correlations. Correlations are going to produce a Pearson's R statistic. Pearson's R statistic will range from -1 to +1, where 1 in terms of absolute value, so two vertical lines means absolute value, and an absolute value means regardless of its sign. So if your Pearson's R is -1 or +1, it doesn't matter as long as it's 1. That represents a perfect correlation, and 0 represents no correlation. And now the sign of that 1, so a -1 or a +1, tells you the direction of the relationship. So if it's negative, then that tells me it's a negative relationship. So what that means is, as scores on one variable are going up, the scores on the other variable are coming down. So on the other hand, if we had, say, a positive relationship, so a +1, for example, that would suggest that as scores on one variable are going up, scores on the other variable also are going up. And we'll see this in a second. So our first research question, which was about the relationship between discrepancy of own ideal, discrepancy of cultural ideals, with all of our well-being outcomes. Let's have a look at this. So we get this really, really big matrix that comes out. And what we can see is our first two columns is the own discrepancy, so discrepancy of own ideal, and then the discrepancy of cultural ideal. What you'll notice is that Stata will only display the 8 characters at once. So if your name has more than 8 characters, at least at the top here it's only doing 8, it'll give you the first 6, a little tilde, and then the last. If you look here, it's showing us a few more characters, but again, it shows us up to the maximum tilde and then one more. So it'll abbreviate sometimes. So if I look at the relationship between your own discrepancy and cultural discrepancy, the first number is my Pearson's R, and my Pearson's R here is 0.79. So this is a strong relationship. It's in a positive direction. I know this because it is a positive correlation. And my p-value is less than 0.0005, so it's basically 0. We never say in statistics that your p-value equals 0 because it doesn't. It's simply that to 4 decimal places, you can't pick up anything above 0. It rounds down to 0. But in reality, if I took this out to an infinite number of decimal places, it would be something other than 0. The number below this is the n, or the number of people in the sample, with data on both own discrepancy and cultural discrepancy. So if someone has missing data, say for example someone didn't do self-esteem, but they did do cultural discrepancy and own discrepancy, I might have 295 as my n here, but I'd have 294 here. So it tells you whether or not there's any missing data. Now let's talk a little bit about what the first two numbers mean, this Pearson's R and this particular p-value. So the Pearson's R is basically saying, if we get a new plot, we have culture going up here, so let's put in cultural discrepancy, and then down the bottom, own ideal discrepancy. And what we are seeing is that as own ideal goes up, scores on cultural discrepancy are also going up. So that's what this positive value means. And the fact that it's 0.79 tells me that it's probably a really strong relationship. Now let's talk about the p-value for a minute. The p-value is one of those things that's really poorly understood. There was actually a study not that long ago looking at experts from a number of different disciplines, including psychology, and they were asked to define the p-value. And I can't remember the exact statistic, but it was something like 20% of the sample were able to actually define the p-value correctly. And these were people who were professors and people with decades of years of experience in research weren't able to define the p-value correctly, despite the fact that this is the thing that so much research hinges on. Now, the p-value is a number that has a direct interpretation. So it gives you some value, and that value represents a percentage, or a percentage or a chance likelihood that your findings are actually possible to find, given your data, given your design, if the null hypothesis was true. So we now need to think about what is a null hypothesis, and then what does this actually mean for the data. So a null hypothesis is essentially the thing that it's almost like the opposite of what you're looking for. So for example, in a correlation, the null hypothesis is that there's no relationship at all. And so if I was to formalize this, I would say that for correlations, the null hypothesis is that Pearson's R equals 0. Remembering that 0 means no correlation. And so then what our p-value actually then represents is the probability that we will get a Pearson's R of whatever it is that we got if Pearson's R was actually 0 in the real world. So p-value is the likelihood or chance of getting our Pearson's R if Pearson's R actually equals 0 in the population. So it's worth us remembering just for a second here, there's a typo, that we have a sample from the population. And there's a likelihood that we have just sampled a particular part of that population that produces a Pearson's R greater than 0, be it in a negative or a positive direction. So in this case, what our p-value actually represents is the chance that we could actually get a Pearson's R of 0.79 if in the actual population that Pearson's R is 0. So it's the chance of getting that value if in the population the null hypothesis was true. So here I could say that the chance of obtaining a Pearson's R of 0.79 on 295 participants, if the null hypothesis was true, if Pearson's R actually equals 0, is less than 0.0005, so it's less than 0.05%. So if I wrote that up properly, and I'll do this in Stata for you, the chance of obtaining a Pearson's R of on 195 participants, if the null hypothesis was true, is 0.05%, or p is less than 0.0005. So it's worth noting here that our hypothesis is actually asking the question, is there a relationship? And our analysis doesn't actually address that. It asks the question, is there evidence for no relationship? Not is there evidence for a relationship? And so that's why we call this group of analyses that we're learning null hypothesis significance testing. We're asking whether or not the null hypothesis is true or if we can reject the null hypothesis. And in this case, we can reject the null hypothesis. So there is no evidence that Pearson's R equals 0, suggesting that there is a relationship. So that's how I would formally conclude on this first relationship, but we're going to do it much quicker for the rest. So now I can look at these two columns to tell me the relationship between own discrepancy and cultural discrepancy. And here I can see for self-efficacy there is a significant negative relationship. So I'm defining significance here as less than a p-value of 0.05. So I guess something that you could add into your conclusions then is therefore we can reject the null hypothesis as our p-value is less than our definition of sufficiently unlikely, i.e. p equals 0.05. You could even say sufficiently unlikely, which is 5%. So we arbitrarily have this cutoff that we use in psychology of p's needing to be less than 0.05 to be significant. This equates to saying that we need the chance of our Pearson's R, the chance of obtaining our Pearson's R if Pearson's R actually equals 0 needs to be less than 5%. It's a totally arbitrary value that we have come up with. There is absolutely no rationale for 0.05 being our p-value cutoff. It's simply the value that we use, and we've used it for decades. It's become so much of a convention, in fact, that if you deviate from 0.05, you actually have to justify the deviation, which is kind of silly when you think about the fact that 0.05 is such an arbitrary value to begin with. Anyway, against 0.05, I can see that self-esteem's p-value is 0.001. So that's lower than 0.05, so I'd say this is a significant negative relationship that's probably very, very weak. The same can be said here for cultural discrepancy with self-esteem. And then if I look at negative affect, again I have two very weak relationships that are both significant, but they're now in positive directions, whereas self-esteem was negative. Here I have moderate positive relationships between shame and discrepancies. And here I have non-significant relationships with depression. So the discrepancy between your own ideal or the cultural ideal of appearance seems to not be related to depression at all. So here I'd say these have got no relationship. And then for anxiety, we can see that anxiety appears to be related to your own discrepancies. It's very weak, but it's there. But there's no relationship with cultural discrepancy. I could look at these if I wanted to, but we're not looking at these today. These are the relationships between our IVs, so we're just going to move on. Now, I should have mentioned before about the syntax to actually look at correlations. I use PW-Core. This stands for Pairwise Correlations, and it's pairwise because we look at two variables at once. I then list my variables, and they're going to appear in my correlations in the order that I list them here. And then I need to put in sig and obs. Sig brings up my p-value, obs brings up the number of observations. If I drop these, I'll just get my Pearson's R, and that's not very helpful. So research question 2, looking at internalization with our well-being variables. I can see self-esteem has a weak negative relationship that's significant. And then all of my others, if I just look down here, all of my p-values are less than 0.05, and they're all in a positive direction with internalization, and they're all a weak relationship, except for shame with 0.4. Okay, and finally, research question 3. So this is looking at trait objectification, or your preference for appearance over physical capabilities. Again, we see a negative, very weak but significant relationship with self-efficacy. There's nothing going on between objectification and negative affect. The p-value is above 0.05. But then for our other three variables, we see weak, positive but significant relationships for shame, depression, and anxiety.